Welcome to today's training, Improving ISP Data Quality, the Do's and Don'ts of Better Documentation. So what is this training about? Well, the goal of today's training is to improve the quality of all types of documentation currently entered into the Therap database system. We'll be focused primarily on discussing ISP data, which are your progress notes or shift summaries, because that is the most common type of documentation entered into the database on a day to day basis. But realistically speaking, the guidelines presented in today's training can and should be applied to all types of documentation, data entry, tracking, and charting that's currently completed in Therap. And to accomplish this, we'll be identifying areas where our documentation is currently less detailed or less objective than we now know is ideal and the standard going forward. And we'll do this by discussing a few key topics. Firstly, we want to change the way that staff think about completing documentation. We know this is going to be a change from how we've instructed staff to complete documentation up until very recently, and it may seem completely new to many newer staff. But for the first time since going fee for service, we're receiving feedback regarding Medicaid and DDD standards for documentation. Many long term staff may remember how documentation was completed before we switched to Therap, or even before we started using other database systems. And for those staff, these guidelines will not be new because at the end of the day, this is really a return to how we completed documentation previously. Secondly, we want documentation to matter to all SCARC staff, regardless of their role within the agency or within the database. DSPs, management staff, and administrators. They all have different roles within the database and interact with the data therein differently, but understanding who enters our data, what that data is used for, and who is accessing the data will illustrate the importance of the accuracy of the information in our database and how it affects our services and the individuals we serve. We'll also talk about different types of information by discussing the differences between subjective and objective information and data, how the language we use and the kind of information documented affects the usefulness and the level of detail of the information in our system. We'll talk about the importance of supporting staff to be able to actually implement these guidelines to write better notes and improve our overall documentation. Because some staff and some programs may be readily able to implement these changes today, but some staff or programs may face greater challenges actually using the information presented here. And finally, understanding the long term effects of improving documentation and creating a more standardized method of documentation across all SCARC programs. Making it easier for staff to move from program to program by ensuring that documentation at one program, like Newton Group Home, is the same as documentation at another program, like Warboss Group Home. In the case of new hires, substitute staff, or emergency pulls, if our documentation looks the same no matter where you work, that's one less thing for staff to need to learn when they work in a new program for the first time. It's less involvement for existing program staff to train or guide incoming staff, and it means more engagement and more interaction with our individuals. So, why are we discussing this now? Well, it really all comes down to Medicaid funding. SCARC is fee for service. We bill Medicaid on a weekly basis, and we get paid on a weekly basis on the assumption that we're providing the appropriate services, that we're providing the services we say we're providing to our individuals, and assuming that we're documenting correctly on those same services. We know that we're providing services to our individuals because we can see that the people served by SCARC are generally happy and healthy. But if our documentation does not accurately reflect the services we are providing, then we can and likely will be accused of Medicaid fraud. And in that case, we would need to pay back some or perhaps all of that money to Medicaid. So it's incredibly important to get our documentation right and to get it right the first time, because that money will have already been used to pay for staff wages, for program maintenance and upkeep, for food, gas, vehicles, transportation, and for any of the services and activities provided to SCARC individuals. Now, SCARC has not been officially audited by Medicaid yet. So, where is this information for these guidelines and changes coming from? SCARC has gotten a lot of feedback from other service providers in New Jersey and from Therap itself. Therap is a company that works with service providers from all across the United States and in turn gives us information from other providers that have been fee for service for much longer than New Jersey providers. These other providers have undergone Medicaid audits and can provide some indication of what Medicaid standards are for documentation. SCARC has also paid an auditing company called Mercadian to come out and complete a mock audit of the documentation that's currently in our database and provide us with feedback. And the feedback that we've gotten from Mercadian and DDD licensing and recertification auditors is that as our documentation currently stands, we would owe money back to Medicaid. The good news is that also according to Mercadian, who does complete official audits for Medicaid, we are not on Medicaid's radar at the moment. The likelihood of SCARC being audited by Medicaid within the next 1 to 2 years is exceedingly slim. This is important because it gives us a chance to identify the issues with our documentation and to improve the quality of our data so that when we are audited by Medicaid in the future, we can be confident that our documentation is an accurate reflection of the work and services actually provided by SCARC staff. So, when does this change take effect? Ideally, now, today, immediately after this training, the next time you complete a shift, at the end of that shift, when you sit down to write your progress notes or your ISP data, you think of these guidelines and the information from today's training and strive to start implementing these changes or whatever changes apply to you. And that's important to mention at this point because we do have some staff that we know write really stellar notes. That information and feedback comes directly from the auditors previously mentioned. So not all of our notes are bad or even in need of improvement. But what we do know is that we need all staff to take the information presented here and think objectively about their own notes. Because as things stand, our notes currently are not consistently good enough across the board to ensure that we'll get paid for services we know we are rendering. You may not need to apply every one of these guidelines to your notes, but identifying areas that are discussed here where you could improve your notes will be key to improving documentation overall. And secondly, we know that this change is not going to happen overnight. Our documentation and notes are not going to be perfect as soon as everyone receives this training. This is going to be an ongoing process for a number of reasons. These changes may not be immediately feasible in every program or for every staff person. Part of this training process, part of the implementation process, is identifying the barriers that may keep staff from being able to improve their documentation. There is currently no official timeline in place, but at some point in the future, these guidelines are going to be the standard for all SCARC staff. Before that happens, we want and need staff input. So when these guidelines do become the standard that we expect all of our staff to meet, there are no staff that feel like this is still an impossible expectation, that staff feel like this kind of documentation is feasible. A more intensive documentation process means that staff are going to need more supports to provide that level of documentation. And giving this training now, getting feedback from staff will make that process smoother and more feasible for everyone. Different staff have different roles and different responsibilities within the Therap database. We want staff at every level to feel a sense of responsibility and ownership of the data they enter into the system or that they're responsible for auditing. What we really don't want is for staff to feel like the data in the system is unimportant or that it doesn't have a purpose or effect on the services provided to SCARC individuals. Daily documentation is not meant to be busy work for the end of the shift, and we don't want staff to approach it that way. So understanding what happens to the information in the system, who and what it's used for, and how it impacts other users may help staff to understand the importance of their daily documentation. And this all starts with DSPs. Our DSPs are typically focused on data entry. They are responsible for 95% or more of all of the data in the system. Unfortunately, DSPs also don't get as much of a chance to review other users' data in the system. And that can often make it seem like their data doesn't go anywhere. We want to illustrate the importance of accurate and detailed notes for all users. Just because DSP should be focused on the data entry side of things does not mean that they should or could not be completing audits of their own data. We want our DSPs to be capable and feel responsible for auditing at a personal level. If a staff person realizes that they've incorrectly entered a note, they meant to write a note for Johnny, but they accidentally wrote it under Susie instead, we want that staff to take ownership of their error, to correct that entry without having to rely on management staff to identify the issue and request that staff make the fix. If staff finish a note for an individual 45 minutes before the end of their shift, and in the last 30 minutes of that shift, the individual has a behavior, needs redirection or additional supports, or there's some kind of emergency, we need the DSP to take ownership of their documentation, to know that they need to go back into the Therap system and update their note to reflect what actually took place in the last 30 minutes of their shift. Beginning with our managers and supervisors, these users are responsible for not only entering information into the system, but also auditing other users' data. And typically, the data that management staff should be responsible for entering would be broader and need to be updated less than day to day. We're talking about things like updating medications, entering in new diagnoses, or entering in provider appointments. But we also know that due to staffing issues, many times our management staff are still responsible for completing notes and other forms of daily documentation. Ideally, we would like for our management staff to be focused on auditing data rather than completing data entry. Because management staff don't audit at a personal level, they audit at a programmatic level. They're auditing data for all of the individuals and all of the staff in any given program, sometimes for days at a time and sometimes for weeks at a time. This results in a significant increase in the amount of data that they're responsible for auditing. So, if we can get DSPs to audit their own information, to identify and fix glaring errors within their own data, that should ease the amount and the amount of attention required for auditing at the management level. For directors, there is significantly less consistent responsibility for data entry. Instead, there is a significant focus on auditing data by other users. But instead of auditing at a programmatic level, directors audit across their entire caseload. Again, by improving auditing at the DSP and management levels, we hope to alleviate some of the responsibility from directors who are responsible for information from all staff at multiple programs and potentially dozens of individuals. Our directors often audit data not only for days or weeks at a time, but often months at a time. And when we start talking about other types of administrators, the accuracy of our data becomes even more poignant. Our directors are typically somewhat familiar with the individuals we serve and the types of services that each one requires. Though they're not as intimately familiar as our DSPs or management staff, other administrators are likely significantly less familiar or maybe completely unfamiliar with an individual's needs or service types. These users typically focus on data extraction and trend analysis with little to no data entry. For those users, the information pulled from Therap is often taken at face value. If that information is incorrect or out of date, those admin staff may be making decisions regarding transportation, maintenance, or financial decisions based on outdated or incorrect information. We need all staff at all levels to feel a responsibility for the data in the system. So when that they notice something is out of date or incorrect, they not only feel the need to make that correction, but they know how to do it, or at the very least, they know who to contact to get that information updated as needed. When documenting in Therap, the type of data and the language used will also affect the quality of our documentation and our ability to safely bill for services. Typically, there are two types of data within our database, those that are subjective and those that are objective. When completing any kind of documentation, SCARC staff should strive to be objective, not subjective. What we often currently see in Therap is information that is subjective. This type of data is often inappropriate for billing purposes. So what is subjective data? Well, subjective data is often emotional and biased. It can express interpretation or passes judgment, and it's often based on personal opinion rather than fact. This is the kind of information or the type of language we want staff to avoid when writing their documentation. What we need from staff is objective data and objective language. So, what is objective information? Objective information is unbiased, it's based on evidence, observation, and measurable data, and the language used sounds clinical and professional. Simply speaking, we want staff to state the facts. Now, it's important to clarify that we do not expect staff to speak or write like robots. Our staff are human beings, providing humane services to other human beings. Our staff typically genuinely care for the individuals they serve, so it's expected that staff can become attached, have biases, speak with emotion, and have opinions regarding the services they provide. It is only human that all of these factors will color staff's documentation and that staff may sometimes be unable to be purely objective in their documentation. It would be unreasonable to expect staff to be robotic in all of their notes. The issue is that we cannot have notes that are purely subjective. Staff cannot be purely subjective in their documentation. Ideally, we need notes that are mostly objective and stick to the facts with occasional mixes of subjective information too. We need facts and evidence that we can build off of. So some common examples that we see in the database today. Something that we would not want to see in a note is something like, Johnny had a good day. What does that mean? What is a good day? For Johnny, for me, or for you, they could be drastically different things. That statement also doesn't tell me anything about what occurred during the shift, why staff feel that Johnny had a good or bad day, or what types of services were provided by staff. It is a purely objective statement and it gives us nothing that we can build off of. Instead, we would rather staff say something like, Johnny smiled throughout the outing and stated numerous times that he was having fun. After returning to the group home, Johnny asked staff if they could go to the farmer's market again soon. Now, obviously, this isn't the entirety of a note for a whole shift, but it gives a better indication of what did Johnny do during the day? How did they interact with staff? How did staff interface with Johnny? And what was the outcome? How did Johnny actually feel? We have evidence in the form of saying that Johnny smiled throughout the outing, that he stated numerous times that he was having fun, and we also follow up by saying that Johnny specifically requested if they could do a similar outing again. It provides me with a lot more information about billable services provided by staff. Additionally, we wouldn't want to see something like Johnny was grumpy or grouchy at day program today, for a multitude of reasons. First and foremost, just like Johnny had a good day, what does that mean? What is grumpy or grouchy? What does that mean for Johnny? And how? How do staff know that Johnny may or may not have been grumpy or grouchy? From this perspective, it looks like staff are assuming Johnny's mental state. Instead, we would rather staff say something like, staff noticed Johnny was frowning and muttering under his breath. Staff asked Johnny if anything was bothering him, and Johnny stated that he had had an argument with a peer at day program. We're stating the facts, we are giving evidence, and we're indicating why staff feel that Johnny was grumpy or grouchy at day program today. It makes sense. Staff have a great base of knowledge for them to make inferences, to be able to assume what's going on behind the scenes. But when it comes to our notes, we have to explicitly write out what staff are seeing and what evidence they have for what conclusions they might be coming to. And it's less that staff absolutely cannot use these specific phrases. Johnny had a good day. Johnny was grumpy. And more that these phrases are not sufficient to be the entirety of a note for a shift. We, in addition to these, need staff to provide evidence, to give us more data, and to give us more examples of what occurred during their shift. ISP data is completed in Therap according to templates. These templates will vary slightly depending on the type of program or the type of service provided, but all templates have the same basic layout and the same general formatting. We want to ensure that all staff are utilizing these templates correctly and similarly, regardless of the specific individual or specific program. Every template has two basic sections. The first is dedicated to rating task categories, and the second section is an other comments text box meant to contain staff's progress note or shift summary for their entire shift. When completing the task categories section, if the service was provided, staff should say that the service was provided by selecting that from the drop-down menu. Then, staff need to list all services or activities from their shift and the level of support required to complete or attempt that service or activity in the corresponding text box. Staff can do this a number of different ways. They can either list all of the activities and then next to each activity put the level of service, or staff can list all of the levels of service and then next to each one list all of the activities that fall under that level of support. Either option is acceptable as long as both pieces of information are included in the text box. Staff must include the list of services and activities and the level of support provided by staff. If the service was not applicable, staff must choose Not Applicable from the drop-down menu, and then no further documentation is needed in the corresponding text box. Going forward, staff also need to be more discerning and comprehensive when deciding which of the two ratings satisfies a service type, whether or not that service has been completed. And a perfect example is the activities of daily living category. This category is purposefully broad and generic. No matter what shift you fulfill, what individual you're documenting on, or which program you're working in, the activities of daily living task category should almost always be selected service provided. Because at some point, regardless of the shift, staff are extremely likely to provide one of the three following services: administering meds, providing supervision, and or serving a meal at some point. And all of these activities, all of these services fall under that activities of daily living category. So regardless of the shift, regardless of the individual, staff should be selecting service provided for activities of daily living. All of the other task categories are very dependent on the program, the individual, and the type of shift that staff are fulfilling or documenting on. This is not commonly an issue with our second shift staff because our second shift staff typically spend most, if not all, of their shift face-to-face or directly interacting with the individuals in the program. More commonly, this is an issue for overnight or first shift staff, and that's because the individuals are often sleeping or attending day program during those types of shifts. But this does not mean that staff are inactive in the program. That does not mean that they are not providing valuable services. These types of staff spend most of their shift cleaning, doing laundry, completing administrative tasks, running errands, scheduling doctor's appointments, picking up meds, going grocery shopping. All of these are valuable services that are being provided by staff that would not otherwise be completed by the individual if staff were not present to assist them or to do the task fully for them. It's the same with refused activities. Just because an individual refuses to partake in an activity does not mean that staff did not provide a valuable service. All of these activities and services, whether the individual was present or not, or whether they refused to actually partake in it, should be documented in that individual's ISP data. When filling out the second section, the Other Comments text box, this is where staff are expected to write a detailed summary of the events and services provided during their full shift. This should not be a word-for-word reiteration of the information from the task categories. A common example of what I'm talking about is toileting or assistance in the bathroom. At the top section, in the task categories rating section, under activities of daily living, if I had to assist someone fully in the bathroom, I would put assistance in the bathroom, full physical assistance. Even if I complete that task 6 times during a shift, I only write it out the one time there. Down in my text box, my other comments section is where I provide all of the additional detail for what that service means. If you're assisting someone fully in the bathroom, chances are you're not doing that once during your shift. You're doing it multiple times, 3 times, 4 times, 6 times. You would want to indicate how many times you provide that service during your shift in that shift summary. You should also be going through and providing additional detail. What does that full physical assistance look like? Do they need assistance with pulling down their pants? Do they have an undergarment that needs checking, changing? Do they need verbal prompts to remember to wipe, or do they need staff to wipe for them? Do you need to prompt them to wash their hands afterwards? You would want to establish whatever the routine is in your text box in your progress note. Every other time during your shift that you physically assist that person in the bathroom, if that physical assistance, if that instance of being helped in the bathroom follows that same routine, you do not need to write out all of those words again. You can simply say, provided full physical assistance according to routine. If for one of those times in the bathroom it doesn't follow that routine, you would in that case have to provide additional information for how that moment in the bathroom deviated from the routine that you've established earlier in the note. When we get to further slides, we'll talk more about the guidelines to provide more specific information and examples of what we're looking for in terms of ISP data. But generally speaking, when filling out that other comments box with your shift summary, you want to think about how much information you're including there based on the individual. If the individual does not typically require extensive supports, it makes sense that your note for that person is shorter or less detailed than other notes you write. If that individual does typically require extensive supports, it makes sense that your note for that person should be longer, more detailed than other notes you write. And if a shift was unusual in any way, if you have an individual who's typically fairly independent, they don't need a lot of supports or services from staff, if that specific shift they needed a higher than normal level of assistance from staff, then that note for that person for that specific shift should be longer, should be more detailed. If there are more services provided, it makes sense that the staff have to provide more supports and more services. Staff should be detailing in a higher level of detail in those notes. The following is our list of guidelines for what not to do when completing your documentation in TheraP. This list of guidelines is generalized. It's meant to be applicable to all individuals and all programs and all staff. Not every one of these guidelines will apply to you or your program or specific individuals that you have to document on. The important thing is to look through the guidelines and think about how you currently do your documentation and attempt to identify which one of these you currently do when you are writing your notes. And to try and change that to what you'll see later is our list of things to do when documenting in the system. So number one on this list is the one that's going to have the greatest impact on your notes and make the greatest visible change to how you document and what level of detail you use. And that is, don't document from the individual's perspective. When we document from the individual's perspective, we have a propensity to gloss over the details and to also omit any information about the services that were provided to the person. We tend to speak about what the individual did for themselves rather than the services that were provided to them. So, a very common example of this are overnight notes, where we see Johnny slept through the night. What information does that give me about the shift? From Johnny's perspective, yes, that's exactly what happened. He went to bed, he wasn't present for most of the shift, and then he saw staff in the morning. He doesn't know of any of the other services that were provided. But when staff come in for an overnight shift, they don't come in, see that the individual is asleep, and then go inactive for the entire shift. They're cleaning, they're doing laundry, they're doing administrative tasks, they're prepping food for breakfast. All of these are important services that staff provide. We don't talk about them because we talk from the individual's perspective. We need to change the way that staff think about the perspective of their note. They are the service provider, they are the note writer. They should not be documenting from the individual's perspective. Number two is don't use generalized language that doesn't detail any information regarding the services provided during your shift. And we've talked about the common example for this one, which is Johnny had a good day. We talked about this one extensively, how it doesn't talk about the services provided, it doesn't give us any details about what actually occurred during the shift, and it doesn't give us any billable services that we can bill Medicaid for. Number three is don't be subjective or use subjective language. We've also talked about this one in our previous examples. The common example is Johnny was grouchy at program today. Doesn't tell us what grouchy means for Johnny, doesn't tell us what grouchy means in general, doesn't tell us what happened during the shift, and it doesn't tell us what staff saw or experienced to assume that Johnny was grouchy. It doesn't tell us how staff rectified the situation and got Johnny away from that grouchy behavior. We need additional details. We need more objective language telling us why we thought Johnny was grouchy at program today. Number four is don't pass judgment or express your opinion. So the example here is Johnny started yelling at staff for attention. How do we know why Johnny was yelling? As established staff in his program, we may know that Johnny is yelling at staff for attention. We may have reasons for why we can assume that. But just this statement here doesn't give us any of that information. It just sounds like staff are assuming why Johnny was yelling. Unless Johnny was yelling, I am yelling at staff for attention, we can't assume that that's why he was yelling. And even in that case, we would want to say, Johnny stated, I'm yelling at staff for attention, so that it doesn't look like we're assuming. We need to give specific information about what was said and why staff came to this conclusion. Number five is don't write the note for a shift if you were not the main service provider for that individual. And this one's a little tricky. So the example we give is Johnny went to the dentist today. If we take that note at face value, it sounds like Johnny went to the dentist today. He didn't need any assistance from staff. We know as SCARC staff that this is extremely unlikely. Johnny very likely didn't schedule the appointment, print out his med consult form, drive himself to the dentist's office, sit in the office waiting room by himself, go into the appointment, record everything that the doctor said, got the doctor's signature, went and picked up his prescriptions on the way home, drove himself back to the program, and then scanned and uploaded his med consult form to Therap. There are no individuals in our services that are capable of doing this fully for themselves, but that is what the note presents. As SCARC staff, we can look at that and know all of the additional details behind the scenes. But when our auditors come, they're not going to look at this as anything other than what it presents at face value. Your note says Johnny went to the dentist today. I guess that means Johnny went to the dentist completely on his own. We have to be more detailed and we have to give the specific information for what happened during that time period. Doctor's appointments tend to be lengthy. If that's 3 or 4 hours of a shift taking Johnny on a dentist appointment, then the staff person that went with Johnny to his dentist appointment ideally is the staff that we want to write that note. Unfortunately, we realize that with staffing issues, scheduling issues, that's not always possible. We need staff to either fill in the information for themselves or to pass along that information to whatever staff it is doing the documentation for their shift. So let's say a staff person comes into the shift, they're doing a partial shift just to take Johnny on the dentist appointment. When they take Johnny on the dentist appointment, they need to document fully. And when they return to the program, if they're not writing the note for that shift because they're only there for part of the shift, they need to find a staff person who is going to document at the end of the shift and pass along the information to them for what services they provided, what happened during the shift, and what kind of supports Johnny needed while he was out at the dentist for that chunk of the shift that day. So, what do those guidelines amount to? What do they look like when they're actually applied in a note? Well, here is just a very generic example of a common note that might occur in SCARC services. So, going through, staff arrived shortly after Johnny returned from program and asked him if he had gone to the bathroom since arriving. We are off the bat documenting from the perspective of staff. Staff accompanied Johnny to the bathroom and physically assisted him with undressing, checking his undergarment, wiping, and changing into a new undergarment. Staff also prompted him to wash his hands. We are, in this case, being descriptive and including specific details for what his assistance in the bathroom looked like. Staff noticed Johnny yawned multiple times while in the bathroom and asked if he was feeling tired. Number 3, we are being objective and we're using objective language. We're not simply stating that Johnny was tired, we're spelling out what we saw and how we came to the conclusion that Johnny was tired. Number 4, Johnny told staff he was feeling tired and his head hurt after day program and he would like to lay down for a bit. Number 4, we are just stating the facts. We're not assuming anything. Exactly what Johnny tells us is what we're putting in our note. Staff prompted Johnny to get up to go to the dentist's office, but Johnny said he didn't want to go. Staff attempted to rouse him 4 times over the course of 20 minutes, but he kept refusing. So staff called the dentist's office to cancel the appointment and then wrote a T-log asking the manager to reschedule. This coincides with number 5. Do accurately represent everything that happened during your shift, even if services were provided while the individual was not present or the individual refused. Johnny had no idea that we had to go and cancel the dentist appointment. It didn't involve him at all, but it's still a service that staff provided. It should be included and documented in our notes, and we'll continue on the next slide. Continuing with our examples of the guidelines, we're starting off with number 6. Johnny remained in bed until dinner. As staff was prepping and cooking dinner, they stopped occasionally to check on him from the doorway of his bedroom. This coincides with number 6 on our list of what to do, and that is to take credit for everything you do to serve the individuals. It may seem like an innocuous little detail, but the fact that staff cared enough to, as they were doing other tasks during their shift, stop, think of Johnny, and go and check on him and make sure that he was still okay is important information, and it's a service that staff provided. Johnny needed multiple prompts to get up for dinner. Johnny told staff he wasn't hungry, so staff wrapped some leftovers for Johnny and stored them in the fridge until he was ready to eat dinner. This coincides with number 7, do include the level of service in addition to services provided. We're talking about Johnny refusing, staff redirecting, providing multiple prompts, and then even though Johnny's not involved, we're setting aside food for Johnny for later in case he's hungry. Staff entered Johnny's room at approximately 7 p.m. and saw that he was sitting up in bed and appeared confused. Johnny asked staff why he was not wearing pajamas, and staff reminded him that he hadn't eaten dinner yet because he was tired after program, and he asked if he wanted to eat now. Before eating dinner, staff prompted Johnny to return to the bathroom, to check his undergarment following his nap, and provided physical assistance to complete the routine. This coincides with number 8. Do reflect a higher dependence on staff with a higher level of detail in your documentation. This may not be a typical afternoon or evening for Johnny. He may not usually need this level of support from staff, this many prompts to just do the basic routine of his day. But the fact is, during this shift, he did need more supports from staff. He did need a higher level of service and a higher level of intention from the staff that was on shift. This note for this shift should be longer and more detailed than a typical note for Johnny. And finally, staff reheated Johnny's dinner while other staff administered evening meds. The staff administered Johnny's meds and needed to redirect him from refusing meds and provided verbal supports and guidance when he expressed confusion, since he typically does not take his meds with dinner and needed multiple reminders of the later time due to his nap. This coincides with a number of them, pretty much number 5 through 9, but it's specifically meant here to illustrate the fact that this staff person that's writing the note spent a lot more time with Johnny during this shift. They were the ones that interacted with him when he got back home from day program, found out about what happened during the day program shift, helped him in the bathroom, was the one that Johnny talked to about going to lay down for a nap, and they're the ones that have followed him throughout the rest of the shift and continued to provide support to make sure that Johnny got everything he needed to have a happy, healthy shift with this staff person. So this is number 9, do complete documentation for individuals to whom you provided the bulk of services. Now I want to talk about why your feedback is so important. At the end of the day, making these changes is not optional. Improving our documentation and implementing these guidelines for all staff at all programs is mandatory. At some point, these guidelines will be the standard for all documentation. Whether that change happens in 3 months or 6 months or a year, we can't wait until then to see if these guidelines are accessible or even feasible for staff. That is why we are training staff now, asking staff to start implementing and using these guidelines now, so that we can identify the issues and barriers now, so that staff can provide feedback that actually affects how and when these guidelines are implemented. It's not helpful to say, I don't want to do this, or I won't do this, or even I can't do this. We need more specific examples than that and more constructive criticism from staff that actually use Therap to document our services every single day. And we need that feedback now so that we can start to work on addressing the underlying issues that make it more difficult for staff to document according to these guidelines. This could include staffing issues, scheduling issues, privacy issues, hardware issues. All of this is incredibly valuable information to improve the quality of documentation in our programs. So please, start to apply these principles on your own. And if spending more time on documentation is not a readily achievable goal for you, your staff, or your program, please provide detailed and informative feedback by phone, by email, talk to your manager, your director, your assistant manager, call me up, email me. We need this feedback to help us address the underlying issues. If there is something in your program that is keeping you from being able to document, if it's not having enough staff, not having enough laptops, not having a stable enough internet connection, if you're spending 45 minutes scanning one med consult and that just makes it impossible for you to upload the 10 med consults you had to during your shift, all of those are valid. It is reasonable to be frustrated by that. It is reasonable to assume that that would keep you from dedicating your time to something more valuable than, say, increasing the level of your documentation. Whatever those issues are, we need to know about them to be able to do something about them. So please speak up. I know it sometimes seems unreasonable to ask that of staff. I know some staff are nervous about talking out about the issues that they see in their program. But really, the only way to affect change is to draw attention to the issues that we know are going on in our programs. So please. And finally, the long-term goal of this training is to bring staff awareness to the value and necessity of their own feedback, their knowledge, and the input that they can have on the Therap database system. If there are any staff that through the course of this training felt a spark of inspiration about the topics being discussed, or if you're a long-term staff that has a wealth of knowledge and experience at their disposal, or even if you just have ideas or feel passionate about getting involved with staff training, the future of Therap as a database, or even just implementing new and different modules and types of documentation, please consider reaching out to your manager or supervisor, your director, or myself. Please consider signing up for future Therap-related committees or pilot groups, and please, at any time, contact me with any feedback, any questions, or any concerns that you may have. I'm always accessible via email or by phone. Give me a call, send me a text, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can. I value all of this feedback, and I would ideally prefer your feedback in writing. It will mean more at the end of the day if I can take this information to those that have the ability to make changes that will affect staff directly. If I can give specifics of this is what's going on in 10 of our programs. 50 of our staff feel this way about our laptops or about our internet connection. So all of your feedback is valuable. All of it has a place and all of it will be used. The problem is just getting us that feedback. So if you have something or if you're interested in helping us to build a community around Therap, helping us to make resources that are actually meaningful for staff. It means something if I say, oh, this is an issue and I've identified this as a potential workaround, but it means more if a manager at, Frieden Group Home can go to Stillwater Group Home and the manager of Stillwater Group Home goes, "Oh, I was going through the exact same thing and this is how I fixed it in my program." It means more coming from the people that are working in the database all day, every day. So I really value everybody's feedback, and I would love any additional information that staff can provide. It's a little bit easier to get that kind of feedback from directors, administrators, even managers and supervisors. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to get that information from DSPs. And DSPs, you are the ones who are doing most of that data entry. You are the ones doing that work hands on. You have the most experience in it. So it really should be your voices that are being heard most of all. So if you have some kind of input, please feel free to reach out to me. I would really highly value it. And that is it for today's training. If you have any feedback specifically about this training, please contact me or Jackie or Jen Green. Thank you.